The story you're about to hear isn't just about a neighborhood dispute. It's about power, injustice, and how someone who seems harmless can become a dangerous enemy, simply due to a little bit of power. But more than that, it's about resistance, how an ordinary person can fight back against the abuse of power to bring about justice, no matter how powerful the opposition is. Sarah Mitchell never thought that renovating her small backyard pool would turn into a tense legal battle, or even lead to a major scandal. Living in a peaceful suburban neighborhood, Sarah decided to renovate her pool after a successful year at her architectural firm. She followed every protocol in the HOA handbook, submitted detailed plans, material samples, and even a 3D rendering to ensure the changes wouldn't negatively affect the neighborhood's aesthetic. Everything was approved by the Homeowners Association, HOA board, except for Patricia Wellington, the newly elected HOA president. So what happened next? A small matter turned into a huge one, and Patricia, who was supposed to be the protector of the community's interests, turned into the mastermind behind a criminal scheme. Surely you're wondering, was it just because the pool tiles were too Mediterranean? Or was there something deeper at play that made Patricia so adamant in opposing it? This story began in the spring when Sarah decided to renovate her pool, but she never expected that this would lead her into an all-out battle with Patricia Wellington, someone who refused to see reason and was willing to do anything to make life difficult for those who disagreed with her. It all started with small letters, warnings about her grass being too tall or her mailbox being insufficiently reflective. But soon, these weren't just minor violations. Patricia wasn't just challenging Sarah's pool plans. She was attempting to control the entire community through the abuse of power. It might sound like a typical story of a neighborhood feud between homeowners association, HOA, officials, and residents, but behind the letters and complaints lay a much bigger conspiracy, one where manipulation and sabotage were at play, as Patricia tried to take advantage of the community's weaknesses for her own benefit. And the intervention of Sarah, alongside an unlikely figure, would completely flip the situation. Sarah wasn't just dealing with an unprofessional HOA president. She was confronted by a woman who would go so far as to interfere with Sarah's property and ruin her hard-earned pool renovation. What began as a conflict over aesthetic choices turned into something much darker. Patricia's actions were not only about controlling Sarah's pool. They were about undermining everything Sarah had worked for. Why would Patricia go so far? Was it truly because of a disagreement over pool design? Or was she hiding something larger, something far more insidious? And what Sarah didn't know was that her pool renovation was threatening a scheme much larger than her own backyard. What started as a personal dispute would soon reveal an organized conspiracy aimed at taking control of the neighborhood for financial gain. The story takes an unexpected turn when Patricia attempts to sabotage Sarah's pool by filling it with cement at midnight. But this time, Sarah wasn't unprepared. Armed with security cameras and a determined spirit, Sarah's attempt to defend her home would lead to an unfolding scandal that no one could have predicted. You're probably wondering, how does someone's backyard pool renovation lead to a scandal that involves law enforcement, criminal charges, and a neighborhood-wide conspiracy? And what role does Sarah play in this unraveling story? What happens next will surprise you, and I promise, it's not what you think. Stay tuned as we dive into how the situation escalates and how Sarah and her community take a stand against injustice in the most dramatic way possible. As Sarah prepared for the next steps in her pool renovation, she had no idea that things would soon spiral into a full-blown nightmare. Patricia Wellington wasn't about to let go of the power she had so aggressively wielded as the HOA president. She continued her personal crusade against Sarah's renovation, and what had started as complaints and citations soon escalated into a campaign of harassment. After Sarah received multiple warnings, many of which were petty, such as one about her grass being too tall and another about her mailbox not being reflective enough, things took a more serious turn. Patricia, in her free time, began to make it her mission to photograph the workers renovating Sarah's pool and take notes, documenting every violation for the HOA's meetings. This wasn't a simple matter of being a concerned neighbor. Patricia had turned this into a vendetta. Every morning, Patricia parked her white Mercedes SUV across the street from Sarah's house, taking pictures with an iPad and claiming she was documenting violations for the HOA's monthly meetings. She made sure to be as visible as possible, trying to intimidate Sarah and her workers. Sarah, trying to handle the situation professionally, reached out to Patricia and suggested they go over the approved plans together. But Patricia dismissed every offer with a sneer, refusing to even entertain the idea of discussing the matter reasonably. "I don't fraternize with rule breakers," Patricia had said with a smug smile. It was clear that this wasn't about the pool at all. It was personal. As if that wasn't enough, Patricia's behavior became even more erratic. When Sarah received an emergency notice from the HOA, it came with an outrageous claim that the new pool's depth markers were in the wrong font. Specifically, they were in a font that wasn't Times New Roman, a requirement Sarah was sure was never mentioned in the HOA guidelines. This absurd complaint caused Sarah to lose her cool for the first time in this entire process. She marched over to Patricia's house, HOA guidelines in hand, ready to settle the matter once and for all. But when Sarah arrived at Patricia's house, she was met with an even stranger situation. Patricia, standing in her tennis outfit, holding a glass of wine, it was barely 11 a.m., greeted Sarah with the same saccharine smile. Patricia explained that she had received several complaints and showed Sarah her own personal copy of the HOA guidelines, which she claimed were more complete than the version Sarah had. Patricia's copy had amendments that hadn't been distributed to the other homeowners, something Sarah found highly suspicious. Yet, Patricia wasn't interested in helping Sarah understand the situation. Instead, she waved it off with a smile, adding, "We have to maintain some executive privileges, don't we?" It was at that moment that Sarah realized just how far Patricia would go. This was no longer about the pool. It was about Patricia's quest for control, and Sarah was just an obstacle in her path. Patricia wasn't following the HOA rules. She was rewriting them, using her position to manipulate and control the neighborhood. Determined to confront the board directly, Sarah requested an emergency meeting to address Patricia's bizarre amendments and actions. The HOA board seemed unaware of the discrepancies Patricia had been citing, and 3 board members responded sympathetically. An emergency meeting was scheduled for the following week. Patricia, of course, wasn't happy about this, and Sarah had no idea just how far Patricia was willing to go to stop the renovation from happening. Later that evening, as Sarah was working late in her home office, she heard the unmistakable sound of a truck backing up outside. Curious, she checked her security cameras and couldn't believe what she saw. A cement truck was parked in the alley behind her house. Patricia, in full designer workout gear, was directing workers to start pouring cement into her pool. Sarah immediately grabbed her phone and began recording, fully aware that something was terribly wrong. As she ran downstairs, her heart raced. What Sarah didn't know was that the security cameras, which she had installed to protect her property, were about to capture an event that would change the neighborhood forever. Patricia's mistake was monumental. So focused on supervising her midnight cement delivery, she failed to notice a few important things. The unmarked police car conducting a routine patrol on her street, the security floodlights she triggered as she entered the backyard, and, most critically, the fact that she was standing directly on top of an underground power line that had been carefully marked by Sarah's contractor. At that very moment, karma was about to play its hand. As Patricia continued to direct the cement truck workers, completely oblivious to the police officer who had been quietly observing from his patrol car, Sarah's security cameras captured the entire situation. Officer James Rodriguez had been in the area and, noticing the unusual activity, decided to investigate the midnight construction. The moment the officer approached, Patricia immediately switched gears and adopted her signature sweet tone. She claimed she was executing an emergency abatement order on the pool, as it had been deemed a community hazard by the HOA. But the officer wasn't fooled. He took the document Patricia handed him, and after reading it carefully, he immediately saw that it was a bogus HOA agenda. It wasn't a legal permit for any construction. Patricia, with all her entitlement, continued to argue that this was a private community matter and that the officer had no jurisdiction. However, Officer Rodriguez remained calm and professional, explaining that pouring cement into someone's pool without their permission could constitute vandalism, criminal mischief, and several other criminal offenses. Just as things were about to escalate, Patricia screamed at the cement truck workers to leave, or she would sue their company. The workers, who were clearly uncomfortable and confused, quickly packed up their equipment and drove away. Patricia's delusional behavior continued, but her chances of succeeding in her scheme were rapidly slipping away. It wasn't long before disaster struck. As Patricia paced angrily, she inadvertently damaged the underground power line that had been marked by Sarah's contractor. The lights in the neighborhood flickered, and suddenly, half the block was without power. Officer Rodriguez immediately called for backup and the power company. But what came next was even more shocking. Patricia's increasingly bizarre justifications started to unravel, and the community would soon realize just how deep her involvement in criminal activity really went. The cement pour wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger scheme that was about to come to light in the most dramatic way possible. As the events of that fateful night unfolded, Patricia's tangled web of lies, harassment, and abuse of power began to fall apart. Sarah, still reeling from the shock of witnessing Patricia's brazen attempt to destroy her pool, knew that this was only the beginning of something far bigger. But she had no idea how quickly things would escalate or how far Patricia was willing to go to avoid facing the consequences of her actions. The police officers had already documented the damage Patricia had caused, including the underground power line, and Sarah had everything on tape. But the truth was even more shocking than Sarah could have imagined. While Patricia continued to play the victim, the real story was about to break wide open. In the early hours of the morning, after the power was restored, the police officers took statements from all involved. Officer Rodriguez had been professional and calm throughout, but even he couldn't suppress the disbelief he felt at Patricia's bizarre excuses. She insisted that the pool renovation was somehow harming the community and its property values. But her arguments made less and less sense as the hours passed. By now, Sarah's neighbors were beginning to gather, intrigued by the late-night commotion. Mrs. Chen, a longtime resident who had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years, couldn't hold back her frustration. "I remember when the HOA was about community, not control," she said, shaking her head as she watched Patricia's increasingly erratic behavior. As the police officers finished their work and advised Sarah to file for a restraining order and document any future incidents, Patricia was handed a citation for the damage to the power line. She was told not to come onto Sarah's property again. Yet, even as the officers were leaving, Patricia, still clinging to her sense of entitlement, turned around and called out, "This isn't over. The HOA board will hear about this tomorrow." Sarah knew that Patricia's threats were far from empty, but what Patricia didn't know was that Sarah had already taken action. While Patricia was busy texting her lawyer and claiming that the whole situation was a misunderstanding, Sarah had been busy forwarding the security footage to every member of the HOA board. She had included a detailed timeline of Patricia's escalating harassment, and what she had uncovered would be the start of Patricia's downfall. When the HOA board convened the next day for an emergency meeting, Patricia was conspicuously absent. She had texted the board, claiming she had a previous commitment, but the other members were horrified as they watched the footage Sarah had shared. This was when the true scope of Patricia's misconduct started to unravel. It turned out that Patricia's actions were far from isolated. Janet Wilson, a board member who had been quietly investigating financial discrepancies within the HOA, uncovered something much more sinister. Patricia had been artificially inflating violation fines and funneling the excess funds into a separate account. This was the first shocking revelation. But the next one would shake the entire neighborhood to its core. Franklin Morris, the local real estate developer, had been involved with Patricia all along. The mysterious man who had been calling Patricia during the night was none other than Franklin Morris, a notorious figure known for buying up struggling HOA communities at steep discounts. Through their collaboration, Patricia had been systematically lowering the property values in the neighborhood, causing financial instability in order to facilitate Frank's real estate acquisition. Once they had bought enough properties at low prices, their plan was to dissolve the HOA entirely and develop the land into luxury condos. Sarah's simple pool renovation had threatened their entire scheme. A well-maintained property with modern amenities would have increased the value of surrounding homes, making it harder for Frank and Patricia to buy up the neighborhood. That's why Patricia had become so desperate to stop the renovation, because it was a direct threat to their financial interests. As this information was presented to the HOA board, They realized that Patricia's vendetta against Sarah wasn't just about personal dislike or the aesthetic of the pool. It was about control, manipulation, and financial gain. The scheme was as audacious as it was corrupt, and the revelations didn't stop there. The district attorney's office was immediately interested in this new information, especially because it involved multiple properties and crossed county lines. By that afternoon, Patricia was being questioned by investigators, and they discovered even more damning evidence. Spreadsheets on Patricia's computer detailing the fraudulent scheme, as well as emails between her and Franklin discussing their plan. Worse still, Patricia had been using the HOA's official email account for all of her dealings, which made everything admissible evidence in court. The following weeks were intense. The investigation continued, and soon enough, Patricia was arrested on multiple charges, including fraud, conspiracy, and attempted vandalism. Her partner in crime, Franklin Morris, turned state's evidence against her in exchange for a lighter sentence. Meanwhile, the local news picked up the story, with reporters swarming the neighborhood to cover what had now become known as the Cement Gate scandal. The most satisfying moment for Sarah came when Patricia showed up at her arraignment, dressed in her usual designer clothes and wearing that signature condescending smile. She walked into the courtroom expecting to charm her way out of her crimes. But when the judge began reading the charges and mentioned the possibility of a 10-year prison sentence, her smile cracked like cheap paint. Her lawyer quickly started negotiating a plea deal, and in the end, Patricia accepted a plea bargain that resulted in 2 years in prison, substantial fines, and restitution to all the homeowners she had fraudulently fined. She was also barred from ever serving on an HOA board again. Frank's company was also hit with heavy fines, and he was forced to sell back the properties he had acquired in the neighborhood. But the biggest win came for the community, which had been torn apart by Patricia's greed and manipulation. In the aftermath, the HOA board was restructured. A new, more reasonable and transparent board, led by Mrs. Chun, rewrote the bylaws to ensure that the HOA would serve the community, not a small group of corrupt individuals. Financial records were now publicly accessible, and all fines had to be approved by a committee rather than a single board member. And as for Sarah, her pool was finally completed, Mediterranean blue tiles and all. To celebrate, Sarah hosted a neighborhood pool party, where neighbors who had once been divided now came together to share in the joy of her victory. Mrs. Chun raised a glass in a toast to Sarah, thanking her for reminding everyone that sometimes, fighting back is the best way to bring a community together. And Patricia? Well, the last Sarah heard, she was adjusting poorly to prison life. Apparently, she had attempted to start an inmate advisory committee to regulate the color of prison uniforms. It didn't go over well, and now her fellow inmates call her the HOA Karen, rejecting her proposals for changes to the exercise yard rules. As for Sarah, she's now enjoying her beautiful new pool, secure in the knowledge that her security cameras are always recording, just in case any future HOA presidents get any midnight construction ideas. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't just about winning. It's about making sure positive change comes from your victory. And, let's be honest, knowing that Patricia's designer athleisure has been replaced by an orange jumpsuit does add a certain satisfaction to Sarah's morning swims. If you enjoyed this story and believe in the power of standing up for what's right, make sure to like this video. Share it with your friends and family so that more people can witness how one person's determination can bring about real change. And if you want to see more incredible stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our latest videos. Remember, it's not just about winning, it's about making sure positive change follows. Let's spread the message together. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.